My name is Victoria Langford. I am 34 years old. And on the night of my father's retirement dinner, in front of 112 guests inside the Meridian Ballroom in Scottsdale, Arizona, my father picked up his champagne glass, gestured across the table in my general direction, and said, loudly, casually, in the tone of a man saying something he has said so many times privately that he no longer registers it as an insult, "That one? She draws little pictures for a living. Don't ask her for money." The table laughed. His new business partners laughed. His golf partners laughed. My stepmother Claudette smiled at her wine glass. I did not flinch. I did not push back my chair. I did not excuse myself to the restroom the way women are trained to do when something lands wrong and they need a moment to recompose without burdening the room. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap on top of the small cream cocktail napkin stamped with the gold logo of the Meridian Ballroom, and I smiled. A small, composed, unhurried smile. The kind my mother taught me to wear when something hurt badly enough that words would only make it worse. What they didn't know was that 11 days earlier, at 7:43 in the evening at my kitchen table, I had signed a licensing agreement worth $1.4 million with Holt Meridian Group, the luxury apparel conglomerate that had just completed a hostile acquisition of my father's company. And the man who had authorized that deal, the billionaire who now technically owned the entire professional legacy Gerald Langford had spent 33 years building, was 30 minutes away from walking through the doors of this very ballroom wearing a jacket I had designed from a textile I had developed with my own hands, in a converted storage unit in Tempe, Arizona. This is that story. Before I take you back to where this began, I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something directly. Wherever you are watching or listening to this right now, I genuinely want to know. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of the world you are in and what time it is there. I mean that sincerely. There is something that moves me every time I think about it. The idea of people in completely different cities and countries and time zones at completely different hours of the day and night, sharing this story at the same moment. And if stories like this one resonate with you, stories about women who were quietly counted out and chose to build rather than beg, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. Every single subscriber is a reason this channel exists and continues. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because there is no way to understand the night of that dinner without understanding the 22 years that preceded it. Gerald Warren Langford was born in Tucson, the second son of a hardware store owner and a school secretary. He worked his way through Arizona State University on a combination of modest academic scholarships and 3 consecutive summers doing construction work in the heat of the Phoenix Basin. He graduated with a degree in business logistics in 1983 and spent the next 8 years working progressively upward through a regional freight brokerage before founding Langford Distribution Solutions in 1991 in a leased office with 4 employees and 1 commercial contract. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did, the company had grown to employ just over 400 people and managed freight contracts for regional retailers across the entire Southwest corridor. Gerald drove a black Cadillac Escalade and maintained a golf handicap of 8 at the Gainey Ranch Golf Club and possessed the particular brand of room-filling confidence that belongs to men who have never once seriously doubted their right to occupy whatever space they enter. He was not cruel in ways that are easy to name or easy to prosecute. He was dismissive, and dismissal, I have come to understand clearly as an adult, is cruelty's quieter, more patient, and ultimately more durable cousin. Cruelty leaves marks. Dismissal leaves nothing at all, which is somehow worse. My mother, Patricia Ann Langford, was a watercolor painter. She painted every morning before the rest of the house woke up. I would sometimes come downstairs at 6 in the morning, when I was 7 or 8 years old, and find her sitting at the kitchen table with her ceramic palette and her collection of sable brushes and a glass of clean water that she changed every few minutes as it darkened with pigment. She worked in layers so thin they looked like light rather than paint. She let each layer dry completely before she laid the next one down. She never shooed me away when I appeared in the doorway in my pajamas. She never performed the work for my benefit either. She just let me be there, sitting on the cold tile floor with the juice box, watching. Being there was its own education. I understood years later, when I was deep in my own making, and making was hard, that she was teaching me patience the way the best teachers teach it, not by instruction but by example, by simply being patient and allowing me to watch. She died when I was 12. Cardiac event, sudden and complete, on the Tuesday morning in March when I was in school. In the middle of a geography lesson about river systems, I came home to my Aunt Rosalind, sitting in our living room with a look on her face that I had never seen on any adult's face before, and have never forgotten since. My mother was 41 years old. On the kitchen table that morning there were 6 watercolors in various stages of completion. I kept every one of them. I have them still. They are hanging on the wall of my studio in Tempe, and I look at them every single morning when I arrive. Gerald handled grief the way men of his particular formation handle grief, which is to say, by not handling it, by replacing it with motion. He worked more hours. He reorganized the company's southwestern operations. He played more golf and attended more industry dinners. And at a certain point, approximately 2 years after my mother died, he began spending time with Claudette Mercer, a woman he had known peripherally through logistics industry circles for years. Claudette arrived in our lives when I was 15. She was all surface warmth and careful positioning. A woman who understood the social architecture of every room she entered and moved through it with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been practicing the performance her entire adult life. She brought with her a son from her previous marriage named Bradley, who was 17 and studying at a prep school in Tempe, and who my father called the one with direction, within approximately 6 months of the marriage. Bradley was pre-law at Arizona State by the time he was 19, then law school at USC. Then a litigation firm in Dallas where he now made what I understood to be considerable money. He was not unkind to me, he was indifferent, which is a different thing and which, in the context of that house, amounted to the same outcome. The pattern that defined my childhood and early adult life was fully established by the time I was 16. It was not dramatic. It was not even, in any individual instance, particularly notable. It was the accumulation of small specific dismissals that build over years into the architecture of a relationship. Gerald's achievements and Bradley's achievements were discussed at dinner. My sketchbooks were tolerated the way certain minor inconveniences are tolerated, with polite patience and no real engagement. My grades were acceptable. My test scores were adequate. Nothing about me in Gerald's accounting indicated trajectory. When I was accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design on a partial scholarship at 17, Gerald sat across from me at the breakfast table, folded his newspaper in the measured way he had, and said, "So you want to spend 4 years learning how to be broke? All right, it's your life." He did not attend the campus visit. He did not ask me what I planned to study or who I planned to become. He wrote a check for the first semester's tuition and handed it to me across the table and considered the matter resolved. I accepted the check with both hands and said thank you, and 2 weeks later I stood alone at the terminal at Sky Harbor Airport at 5:47 in the morning with one suitcase, one portfolio case, and the distinct and clarifying sensation of a person who has understood, finally and completely, that the audience they have been performing for was never going to applaud. I was not sad at that realization. I was, I think, relieved. Providence was 4 years of exactly what RISD promised, which was hard, detailed, rigorous work in the company of other people who cared unreasonably about craft. I studied textile design with the intensity I had been saving since I was sitting on my mother's kitchen floor. I learned to think about fabric structurally, about how weave architecture produced not just texture but behavior, how a textile moved with a body, how it held light, how it aged. I failed at things repeatedly and learned more from the failures than from the successes, which is the specific mechanism of a design education when it is working correctly. I graduated and moved to Brooklyn, where I worked as a junior textile designer for a small firm in the garment district for 3 years. The firm was called Parcel Studio, and it occupied 2 floors of a building on West 37th Street that smelled perpetually of sizing and machine oil. My direct supervisor was a woman named Donna who had been in the industry for 20 years and who taught me more about the commercial realities of textile production in my first 3 months than I had learned in 2 years of study. Donna was exacting and unsentimental, and she had no interest in your feelings about a design, only in whether the design would hold up in production at the required cost per yard and arrive on time. I learned to think the way she taught me to think, not about what I wanted to make, but about what the constraints of production allowed, and within those constraints, what was still possible. It was a different kind of patience from my mother's. It was the patience of someone who has learned to work with reality rather than despite it. The pay was modest, and the hours were long, and I shared an apartment in Bed-Stuy with 2 other women from the industry, one of whom, Denise, would eventually become one of my closest friends. In the evenings I sketched. On weekends, I visited fabric stores in the Garment District and Chelsea Market, and a small Japanese import supplier in Queens that carried specialty weave samples from mills in Kyoto and Osaka. I spent my free money on fabric samples and my free time on sketchbooks. I sent sketchbooks home for Christmas. I called my Aunt Rosalind on Sundays. I visited Phoenix twice a year and sat across from my father at meals where he asked whether I had considered switching to something more stable with reasonable benefits. At Thanksgiving, when I was 22, Gerald introduced me to his business partners as the artsy one. She does something with fabric. When I came home for Christmas at 25 with a bound lookbook for my first independent collection, he leafed through it with the careful tolerance of a man handling something he does not intend to keep, handed it back, and asked if I had looked into project management certification because design was, in his view, not a real career path in the current economy. When my work appeared in a regional design publication called Southwest Craft Quarterly, Gerald left the magazine on the kitchen counter with a yellow sticky note on the cover. The note said, "Saw this. When does it pay?" I peeled it off carefully and kept it. I still have it, folded inside the first sketchbook I filled after I made the decision to stop explaining myself to anyone. I moved back to Phoenix in the spring of the year I turned 31. My father's physician had flagged elevated blood pressure and early cardiac stress indicators, and I was his only biological child, and the honest truth was that I wanted to be close in case something happened. I want to be equally honest about the other truth. The storage unit I had found in Tempe during a research trip the prior autumn had east-facing windows and 800 square feet and rented for $840 a month, and the desert morning light was the exact quality of my mother's kitchen in March, flat and clean and entirely without pretense. I could hold both truths at once by then. I had been learning to hold multiple true things simultaneously for some time. I named the studio Ailewen, a Cornish word meaning elm tree. I had read that elm groves often appear to be separate trees, but share a single underground root system, that what looks like individual organisms is often one organism expressing itself through many surfaces. It seemed like the right name for work that looked solitary but was made from everything I had ever absorbed from every teacher and every fabric and every failure and every morning on a kitchen floor, watching someone who was patient enough to wait for each layer to dry. The first year at Ailewen was a year of foundations. I spent 6 weeks building out the space, sourcing a used industrial sewing machine from a closing fabric school in Flagstaff, acquiring a cutting table from a theatrical costume shop in Mesa, and setting up a sampling area against the east wall where the morning light arrived first. I installed the 6 watercolors on the north wall, spaced evenly, in simple wooden frames. Every morning when I arrived, that was the first thing I looked at. I applied to 7 boutiques in the Phoenix and Scottsdale area with wholesale packages and was accepted by 3, a women's clothing boutique in central Scottsdale called Vesper, a curated concept shop in downtown Tempe called Olive District, and a home and apparel store in Arcadia called The Pale Room. I set up accounts with each of them, delivered initial stock on a Tuesday in early October, and returned 2 weeks later to find that Vesper had sold out of the small collection entirely and was asking for a reorder. I drove home from Scottsdale that afternoon with the reorder form on the passenger seat and said nothing to anyone. I took on 4 custom commission projects that first year. One of them was a bridal party of 6, which kept me at the studio for 17 consecutive days in August in the Phoenix heat, with the one-window unit air conditioner working at its absolute limit. I finished on a Saturday evening, loaded 6 garment bags into my car, delivered them to the client's home in Chandler at 9 in the evening, drove home, ate a bowl of cold leftover rice standing over the sink, and went to sleep. The client's thank you text arrived at 7:30 the following morning and said, "Victoria, I cried when we put them on. I don't have words." I kept that text. I have screenshots of all the texts like that, going back years. I keep them not out of vanity, but out of necessity, for the days when the work is hard and the progress is invisible, and you need to be reminded that the work is real. The second year at Elowin began with a rejection that was useful in the way that certain rejections are useful. Not because they tell you the work is wrong, but because they sharpen your understanding of what it needs to become. I had submitted a wholesale proposal to a Scottsdale boutique called Marin, which was the kind of store I wanted the Elowin line to eventually live alongside, and they passed in a single-paragraph email that said the collection was lovely but not commercially positioned for our clientele. I kept that email. I printed it and pinned it above my workbench for 2 weeks, not out of bitterness, but because I needed to understand exactly what it was telling me. The word positioned was the useful word. It told me the work was seen, but not yet placed correctly in any established frame of reference, which meant the work was neither insufficient nor wrong. It meant the frame did not yet exist, and the only way to build a frame that does not exist is to produce work that makes the absence of the frame feel like the problem. I spent the following 3 months doing exactly that. I made 16 pieces, photographed each one in the early morning light, documented the process in writing in a separate notebook I kept beside the sketchbooks, and produced a proposal document that was less a wholesale pitch and more a visual argument for why the Elowin line occupied a specific gap in the current southwestern luxury market. I sent it to 7 stores. 4 responded. 2 placed orders. 1, a boutique in Sedona called the AITA, placed an order large enough to require me to work 6 consecutive 12-hour days to fulfill. I delivered it on a Thursday morning and drove back through the desert in the early afternoon, feeling the specific tiredness that is not depletion but saturation. It was during the second year at Elowin that I developed the textile I would eventually call the Elowin lattice. I had been studying traditional Navajo weave geometry for months, specifically the interlocking diamond forms in the 2 Gray Hills tradition, and I was thinking about how to translate that structural logic into a contemporary suiting textile that carried the architectural intelligence of the original without the cultural weight of direct quotation. It was a problem I worked on carefully and over a long time. I produced 11 sampling iterations across 4 months. The first 3 were structurally unsound. The 4th through 7th were structurally sound but visually inert. The 8th and 9th had the visual quality I was looking for but lost it in pressing. The 10th was close. The 11th, produced on a Friday afternoon in February, was the version. It had a diamond weave intersect pattern that caught available light and returned it differently depending on the viewing angle, producing a low-level iridescence that was entirely structural rather than chemical or surface applied. No metallic thread, no gloss coating, no surface treatment of any kind. The luminosity was produced entirely by the geometry of the weave, by the specific angle at which the threads crossed, and the ratio of warp to weft at each intersection. I sat with the 11th sample for 3 days, under different lights and at different times of day, before I was ready to believe it was what I thought it was. On the 1st of March, I submitted Elowin Studios' work to the American Design Collective's annual Emerging Designer Showcase. The ADC was nationally recognized and rigorous. Their showcase had launched 4 designers into significant commercial partnerships over the previous decade. The submission required a full portfolio documentation, an artist statement, 3 letters of professional reference, and a physical sample collection. I spent 4 weeks preparing everything with the care I gave to anything that genuinely mattered. I photographed every piece at 6 in the morning against the white walls of my studio when the light came in flat and clean. I wrote the artist statement 3 times. The first version was too explanatory. The second was too spare. The third said exactly what I meant without one unnecessary word. I uploaded the full submission package at 11:51 on a Wednesday night, 9 minutes before the midnight deadline. Then I closed my laptop and went to sleep, because the decision had been made and the outcome was no longer mine to hold. In the months between the ADCC submission and the notification, I continued building. I did not allow myself to think about the submission the way a person waits for exam results, with the anxious forward-leaning that pulls all attention toward an outcome that has not yet been decided. I worked. I added 2 new wholesale accounts and ended the 3-month period with Eloan's first month of revenue above $9,000. I designed a small capsule for the winter season, 4 pieces built around the Eloan lattice in a navy and charcoal colorway, and sold out of the entire run across my 3 retail accounts within 6 weeks. I noted this with the specific calm of a person who is beginning to understand, through accumulated evidence rather than wishful thinking, that the thing they have been building is actually working. I found out I was accepted on a Tuesday morning in February while I was eating oatmeal at my kitchen table. I read the email twice, set down my spoon, and said nothing to anyone. The showcase was held over 3 days in April at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. I flew out on a Thursday morning, checked 1 rolling rack of garments as oversized luggage, and arrived at the Mart to set up my booth alone. Booth 47, 12 feet by 12 feet of concrete floor and pipe and drape walls. I brought a standing rail, a folding table, and 350 lookbook cards I had printed at the FedEx on Mill Avenue for $214. I set up in 2 hours, ate a protein bar standing at the rail, and opened at 9 o'clock. The first day was steady and real. 40 to 50 visitors, several genuine conversations, 12 lookbooks distributed. I stood at the booth for 11 hours. I ate dinner at the hotel bar alone with my sketchbook open beside my plate, documenting the day before I lost the texture of it. On the second day, at 2:17 in the afternoon, a woman in a camel-colored blazer stopped at my booth. She was carrying a program and a half-finished coffee, and she looked at the pieces on the rail, and then at the swatches of the Eloan lattice pinned to the display board, for a long time without speaking. Not browsing, looking. There is a specific and unmistakable quality to the gaze of someone who is actually seeing your work, as opposed to someone who is performing appreciation of it, and this woman had it completely. When she finally spoke, she said, "The structure in these shoulder seams, who taught you that?" I told her I had worked it out myself over about 2 years of failed attempts. She smiled, put down her program, and handed me her business card. Senior Acquisitions Director, Holt Meridian Group. Her name was Rosalind Park. I did not call her that day. I went back to my hotel room, ordered dinner from room service, and spent 2 hours doing research with the careful attention I brought to every significant thing. Holt Meridian Group was a luxury apparel conglomerate headquartered in New York, with holdings across ready-to-wear, accessories, and textile licensing throughout North America and Western Europe. Their chief executive was Elliot Farrow, 53 years old, known in trade coverage as precise, decisive, and entirely uninterested in performing warmth he did not actually feel. In the previous 18 months, Holt Meridian had completed 4 acquisitions. One of those acquisitions, finalized 11 weeks before the Chicago showcase, was a regional logistics firm in Phoenix, Arizona. Langford Distribution Solutions, my father's company. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark of that hotel room for a long while, thinking about the geometry of coincidence, and whether coincidence is even the right word for the way things converge along lines you have been laying for years, without knowing yet where they led. I called Rosalind Park the following Monday. Over the next 4 months, we had 11 conversations, 3 formal presentations, and 1 in-person meeting in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown building in New York, where I took the red-eye and presented in a blazer made from the 4th Eloan lattice sampling, the one before the version that worked, because I wanted to wear something that showed the history and not just the outcome. My attorney, Claire Nikishima, was on every call from the 3rd one forward. I had hired Claire 18 months before the Chicago showcase, with $3,000 I did not easily have, because my friend Denise, who had started her own small food business and understood what it meant to build something alone, had told me once that hiring a good lawyer before you need one is the most important investment a woman building anything will ever make. Denise was right. Claire was exceptional. She understood the licensing space, she understood standard royalty structures and escalation clause mechanics, and she asked every question I had not yet thought to ask, with the patience of someone who understood that the stakes were real. There were moments during those 4 months when I was not certain the deal would come together. There was a period of 6 weeks in the late summer when communication from Rosalind's team went quiet, and I did not know whether the silence meant a loss of interest, a competing priority, or simply the ordinary pace of an organization running multiple simultaneous processes. I did not call. I did not send follow-up emails beyond the single check-in Claire advised after 3 weeks of silence. I went to the studio every morning. I worked. I produced 3 new pieces for a local artisan market in November. I had lunch with Denise on a Thursday and told her I was in a licensing conversation with a major group and could not say more yet, and she looked at me across the table and said, "I believe you entirely," and changed the subject, which was exactly what I needed from her. When Rosalind called again in late August and opened with "Sorry for the delay, we had an internal restructuring month. Where were we?" I said, "The supply-sensing clause," and she laughed and said, "Right. Okay, let's go." The final negotiation call lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. Claire and I sat in the conference room of her downtown Phoenix office, with her associate Maura on the line, and Rosalind was on speaker with 2 members of the Holt Meridian Contracts team. 11 points of negotiation. We resolved 10 in the first 2 hours and spent the final 80 minutes on the sublicensing restrictions clause, which was the one I cared about most, for reasons that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with what would happen to the Elohim lattice beyond the initial term. We reached final agreement at 11:44 in the evening. I thanked Rosalind and her team. After the call ended, I put my head down on the conference table for about 45 seconds, which was all I allowed myself. On the 14th of September, I signed 3-year initial term, exclusive use rights within the luxury ready-to-wear category, minimum guaranteed royalties totaling $1.4 million over the term, a co-branded capsule collection to be launched under both the Holt Meridian and Elohim Studio names, with the Elohim lattice as its centerpiece textile. Claire reviewed the final document for 4 hours before she let me sign it. I signed at 7:43 in the evening at my kitchen table, alone, with the same pen I had used to draw the original sketches for the collection 2.5 years before. I poured 1 glass of red wine. I sat on the kitchen floor the way I used to sit beside my mother. I looked at the 6 watercolors on the wall. I was quiet for a long time. It was enough. I told no one. I held the silence for 11 specific days for a specific reason. What I knew, and what Gerald did not know, was that Elliot Farrow had confirmed his attendance at the Meridian Ballroom retirement dinner. He had been invited by the Langford Distribution Board as a goodwill gesture during the acquisition transition. He was flying in from New York, and Rosalind had mentioned, during a call in the final weeks of negotiation, that Elliot intended to wear a piece from the Holt Meridian pre-launch capsule sample to the Phoenix event, a structured charcoal jacket, built from the Elohim lattice, the textile I had designed on the east wall of my studio in the same desert morning light my mother had always loved best. I want to stop here before the dinner sequence and ask you something. Tell me where you are right now, how far into the story you are, and whether any part of what I have been describing is familiar to you. Had you ever built something quietly while the people in your immediate life had absolutely no idea it was happening? Have you ever been in the middle of a significant thing and been unable to share it because the sharing would have required an explanation you had already given too many times to people who never received it? Drop a comment right now. I read every single one, and if you have not yet subscribed to Revenge Chronicles, this is the moment. Every subscription is a reason this channel keeps telling these stories every day. The retirement dinner, 112 guests, the Meridian Ballroom in Scottsdale, at 7 in the evening on the 25th of September. I wore a dress I had made myself, deep forest green silk crepe with a structured shoulder line and minimal ornamentation along the bodice. No one at table 7 commented on the dress. I had not expected them to. At 7:52, Douglas Hart leaned across the table and asked what I did for a living. And before I could answer, Gerald, 4 seats away, turned his head and said it, clear, easy, carrying across the ambient noise of 100 people. That one? She draws little pictures for a living. Don't ask her for money. The table laughed. I sat with my hands folded on the cream napkin. I smiled my mother's smile, and somewhere quiet inside me, something that had been bending for a very long time simply stopped bending. Before I describe what happened at 8:47, I want to describe the 11 days between the signing and the dinner, because those 11 days are their own kind of story. I went to the studio every morning at 6:15. I worked on a commissioned piece for a client in Paradise Valley, a silk jacket in a deep aubergine with hand-stitched detail work along the collar. I answered emails. I had a call with Claire on the 3rd day to confirm that the signed agreement had been received and acknowledged by Holt Meridian's contracts team. I had coffee with Denise on the 5th day and said nothing about the signing, though I wanted to. I visited my Aunt Rosalind for dinner on the 7th day, and she asked how I was doing, and I said very well, and she looked at me for a moment, the way she sometimes looked at me, with the particular perception of someone who knew me well enough to know when I was carrying something significant, and she said, "All right then," and passed me the bread. I attended the Meridian Ballroom dinner on the 11th day and sat at table 7 in my green silk crepe dress and waited, with my hands folded on the cream napkin, for the work to make itself visible. At 8:47, the main doors opened. Elliot Farrow walked in wearing the charcoal-structured jacket. The Eloin lattice pattern was visible even across the width of that ballroom, the diamond weave intersect catching the overhead light and returning it in the particular layered way I had spent 6 months figuring out how to produce. It was unmistakably mine. There was nothing else like it in the world, and it was walking through the doors of my father's retirement dinner. Gerald saw him and moved immediately to intercept. "Mr. Moonan, Farrow, Gerald Langford, thank you for making the trip." Elliot Farrow shook his hand. "Mr. Langford, congratulations on the retirement." Then he looked across the room with intent and found me and crossed directly to where I was sitting. I stood. He extended his hand. "Ms. Langford, Elliot Farrow, Rosalind sends her regards. She asked me to tell you that this jacket has received more compliments this evening than any single piece she has placed in 3 years." The table went completely silent. Gerald had followed Elliot Farrow across the ballroom floor and was now standing 3 feet away, watching this exchange with an expression I had never seen on his face in 34 years. It was the expression of a man recalculating a figure he had written off completely. Connor Weber, the Holt Meridian regional director, stepped forward and withdrew a small cream envelope from his breast pocket. "Rosalind asked us to pass this along." Inside was a handwritten note on Holt Meridian letterhead. "Welcome to the family. The first invoice is being processed this week. I hope tonight is everything it should be." I set the envelope face down on the table. Elliot Farrow looked at the table with the easy directness of a man who has no interest in softening facts. "Your daughter is extraordinarily talented. We signed the licensing agreement for the Eloin Studio textile line 11 days ago. The collection is going to be a central part of our spring rollout." He looked at Gerald for exactly 1 moment. "You must be very proud." Gerald said nothing. In 34 years, I had never seen him at a loss for words. Claudette appeared at his shoulder. She looked at me, then at the jacket, then at me again, with the expression of someone reading a text in a language they had never thought to learn. My Aunt Rosalind put her hand over mine under the table. She said nothing. She did not need to. Elliot Farrow stayed for 30 minutes. He spoke with me for 11 of those minutes about the spring production timeline, about the co-branded launch event Rosalind was planning for March, about a potential editorial partnership in early discussion stages. He was precise and warm in the way of someone who does not perform either quality. When he left, he shook my hand. "We will speak next week." That was all. The room took several minutes to return to ambient noise. Table 7 stayed quiet considerably longer. Douglas Hart said carefully, "So you said Eloin. Is that the name of the studio?" I said. "And the brand, and the textile line that Holt Meridian just brought into their spring collection." He nodded slowly. The woman beside him, whose name I had been introduced to at the beginning of the evening as Douglas's wife Patricia, looked at me and said, "I would love to know more about your studio." "My daughter is at SCAD." I told her to reach out and gave her a lookbook card from the small stack I had put in my bag that morning on an intuition I still cannot fully explain. 2 other guests at adjacent tables who had overheard the exchange with Elliot Farrow turned in their chairs and asked questions. A woman named Diane, who worked in commercial real estate, asked whether Eloin Studio would ever have a retail presence. A man who had been one of Gerald's freight clients for a decade said he had a daughter in textile design and asked if I ever took mentorship conversations. I said yes to both with the calm of someone who has a lot more room than they did 11 days ago. I watched the room recalibrate around me. The quiet social adjustment of people who have been measuring someone with the wrong instrument and have just received better data. It was not satisfying in the way I had imagined satisfaction would feel back in the years when I had allowed myself to imagine it. It was quieter and more factual than that. It simply made true, publicly, something that had always been true. The visibility was new. The thing itself was not. Gerald found me at 9:23 near the east window where I had gone to stand alone in the way I had always stood alone at events that were technically mine, but never felt like they were. He moved through the room without his usual possession of space. Victoria. My full name. He used it almost never. Dad. He stood beside me looking at the city. Phoenix at night in late September has a specific quality. The desert retaining the day's heat, the grid of lights stretching to where the mountains cut the horizon. We stood there, and neither of us spoke for a while. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about the sticky note on the kitchen counter. I thought about the Christmas lookbook he leafed through and handed back. I thought about the train platform at 5:47 in the morning when I was 17, standing alone with one suitcase and a portfolio case, watching the other passengers whose people had shown up to send them off. I thought about my mother's hands, always patient, always reaching. "I tried telling you for about 15 years, I said. I stopped because it became clear it wasn't something you were built to hear yet." He was quiet. Gerald Langford. Quiet. It was one of the strangest things I had ever witnessed in connection with him. "I'm sorry," he said, "for tonight, for what I said." "Tonight was one of many," I said. "Not with anger. The way you say something true about geography, as a statement of fact about the landscape, not an accusation." He turned and looked at me without his public ease over his face. Underneath it was something older and less comfortable. I recognized it because I had been watching for it for years, wondering if it would ever arrive. It was the thing that has to exist before a person can begin to change. Whether he would do anything with it, I did not know. I made no assumptions in either direction. "You built all of this yourself," he said. "Yes, while you were here." "While I was here." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder in the way fathers do when they do not know what else their hands are for. Then he walked back toward the room. I stayed at the window and watched the city and thought about my mother and about patience being the whole craft. The week following the dinner was quiet in the way that genuine transitions always are, without the dramatic music the moment might seem to call for. Gerald called me on the 4th day after the dinner. Not a text. A phone call, which he had not made to me in perhaps 2 years. He asked if we could have coffee. I said yes. We met on a Thursday at 9 in the morning at a coffee shop in Arcadia, and we sat across from each other for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He asked about Eloin Studio. He asked how long the Eloin lattice had taken to develop. He asked about the Chicago showcase. He asked real questions, the kind that require actual listening before they can be formed, the kind you cannot ask if you have already decided you know the answer. Whether this was the beginning of a genuine shift or a temporary adjustment prompted by surprise and social recalibration, I could not know from one coffee meeting, but I noted it. I filed it beside the thing I had seen under his face at the window, and I decided to leave the door at a specific degree of openness and let time and his behavior determine what came next. I did not forgive him in that coffee shop. I want to be precise about that. Forgiveness is not an action taken at a table over Americanos. It is not a transaction completed in exchange for an apology. It is a decision made again and again, over a long period of time, as the behavior either continues or changes. What I chose in that coffee shop was something smaller and more specific. I chose not to foreclose the possibility of something better. I chose to treat the door as something that could still open, and to leave the mechanism in working order, without any promise about whether or when it would. Claudette did not call or text. Bradley sent a single text message that said, "Heard about the deal. Cool." I did not respond. My Aunt Rosalind sent tulips, because she had always remembered they were my mother's favorite. The card was in her handwriting. She would have known all along. The first royalty payment cleared on the 19th of October. $112,000 deposited to the Elohim Studio business account at 7:14 in the morning. I was standing at my workbench in the studio, cutting a length of linen for a commission project, when the notification arrived on my phone. I set down my scissors. I stood there looking at the 6 watercolors on the north wall, at the morning light coming through the east window flat and clean, at the bolts of fabric on the shelving I had built myself from pine boards and L brackets, the first month I moved into that space. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not call anyone. I just stood there in the quiet of the studio and let the number on my phone be real. The Holt Meridian co-branded capsule launched in March with an editorial placement in a national fashion publication and a launch event in New York that Rosalind organized with the particular attention to detail of someone who understood exactly what the moment represented. I flew to New York for the event. I wore a piece from the collection, a structured blazer in the Elohim lattice in the original charcoal colorway. Rosalind met me at the entrance and introduced me to editors and buyers with the ease of someone who had always expected this evening to happen. Elliot Farrow attended briefly, shook my hand, said the spring sell-through figures were running ahead of projection, and left. That was all he needed to say. I called my Aunt Rosalind from the hotel that night. I told her about the launch. She listened without interrupting, which was her particular gift. When I finished, she said, "Your mother would have put on her best sweater and stood in the back of the room and watched everything." I had to be quiet for a moment after that. Then I said, "I know." And she said, "Good. Now get some sleep. You have work tomorrow." Which was true and was also everything. Gerald came to see the 6 watercolors in May. He drove to the studio on a Saturday morning, and I made coffee, and we stood together in front of the north wall and looked at my mother's paintings for a while without saying anything. He asked about one of them, a small pale wash of saguaro cactus in early morning light, whether I remembered her making it. I told him I had watched her work on it on a Saturday morning when I was 8 years old, that she had let me mix the first wash in the ceramic palette. He looked at it for a long time. She was talented, he said. I didn't understand what that meant when she was alive. He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. That was when I understood, more completely than I had at the retirement dinner or at the coffee shop in Arcadia, that this was the real reckoning, not public, not witnessed by anyone. Just 2 people standing in front of 6 watercolors in a studio in Tempe on a Saturday morning, finally honest about what they had each lost and what they had each failed to see while they still could. There is something I want to say now, directly, to whoever is watching or listening to this, at whatever hour it is, in whatever part of the world you are in. Not about the career, not about the specific mechanics of how any of this came together, about the underlying thing, about the experience of sitting in a room full of people who have known you your entire life and being entirely unseen by them. About the specific exhaustion of trying to be legible to someone who has already decided what category you belong in. About the quiet internal decision, made somewhere along the way without ceremony or announcement, to stop spending your energy on performing worthiness for an audience that has already written its review. If that resonates, hear this. The energy you are spending trying to change a fixed mind is energy you could spend building something that eventually speaks for itself. Not because revenge is the goal. Revenge was never my goal. My goal was the work. My goal was Elowen and the morning light and the 6 watercolors on the wall and the textile I was trying to make. The dinner, the jacket, the look on my father's face, those were not the story. Those were a footnote to a story I had been writing for 15 years in sketchbooks and studio hours and applications that went nowhere, and one afternoon at 2:17 in a booth in Chicago where someone finally stopped and actually looked. The people who have dismissed you are not your audience. They never were. Build for the people who will stop. Build for the version of yourself sitting on the kitchen floor, watching someone who was patient enough to wait for each layer to dry. Build like it matters, quietly, without requiring anyone else to agree with you yet, because the work, when it is real, eventually makes itself undeniable. Here's the question I want to leave with you. Is there someone in your life who has consistently underestimated you? And have you ever had the experience, even once, of watching them recalibrate in real time when the work finally made itself visible? Tell me in the comments. Tell me the whole thing. I genuinely want to read every single one. And now, a word directly to every person watching this from wherever you are in the world. Thank you. From all of us at Revenge Chronicles, thank you. You gave close to an hour of your time to this story, and that is not something we take lightly or for granted. Every view, every comment, every like, every subscription is the reason this channel exists and the reason we come back every single day to tell these stories. If this story reached something in you, if any part of it felt familiar or true or useful, please share it with one person today who might need it. And if you have not yet subscribed, do it now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. We are here every day. We are not going anywhere. And we believe completely that the quietest comebacks are always built in silence.